Right, thanks. So no pressure. I'm Alistair. I work for a company called Sabre, and we build software to help teams work well together. And so tonight I'm going to talk about teamwork. And I know what you're thinking. You are thinking corporate bullshit, stock photos from the 90s, and bad stuff. So what I think about when I think about teamwork is I think about mathematics, which might sound funny, but I'm an aerospace engineer, and the thing that really interests me most is systems. And what I want to know about systems is how they work, and I want to be able to model systems. And you can't have a more interesting system than human systems. And I want to sort of give you an example of how the complexity, the seeming complexity in natural systems can actually be modeled very, very simply. So this is a flock of starlings. It's a flock of birds. It's called a murmuration. Anyone seen these in real life? Yeah. Super cool, right? They are really complex systems. There are thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of birds, all acting in unison. And yet there's no clear leader. And they must be acting with some goal. May find food, to find a nest, to find Africa, whatever. And what I want to do as a systems engineer is try to understand this system in the simplest possible way and to model it. And what I want to show you just now is how this system can be modeled mathematically using only 3 rules. So this is an approximation, a mathematical approximation of the flock of starlings. Each dot is a bird, and the first sort of approximation is each bird is flying at a different direction and at a different speed. So we're going to apply the first rule, and the first rule is that each bird must fly at the same speed. So already the system becomes easier to understand, but it doesn't look anything more like the real system. So the next rule that we're going to apply is that each bird must stay close to its neighbors. So now we have a system which looks a little bit more like a flock, but it's not a realistic flock. And so we're going to apply the third and final rule to this system, which is that each bird must avoid danger. So danger is represented by those 2 larger white spheres. And you can see that just with these 3 rules, we've taken an incredibly complex natural system and modeled it almost precisely. And this is what I like about teamwork, is that it is a seemingly really complex, emotional thing that has no rules to it. But what I want to do as an engineer is to think, well, what are the rules to teamwork? And how can we start to understand it? And one of the most interesting rules about this system is that in order for it to work best, in order for you to get the best results out of this model, when I say each bird must stay close to its neighbor, each bird must stay closest to only its closest 7 neighbors. And that's what produces the best results. And what I notice in organizations and teamwork is that they kind of look a little bit like this. You've got loads of people doing loads of stuff, and they can often seem like there's no unified direction. And what's important to notice about organizations is that just like a flock of birds, it's not one big thing. It's a collection of lots of local things. Just like in birds, there's a collection of teams of 7. In organizations, we are also a collection of teams. And in case you didn't think teams are important, I want to show you a bit of data to support this idea. My hypothesis is that in order for the hardest problems of today's world to be solved, it actually requires teamwork, not individual brilliance. And the best place to look at this is like the pinnacle of individual brilliance, the Nobel Prize. And if you look at a history of the Nobel Prize, in every category except for literature, the Nobel Prize is being shared by more and more people. Which means that in order to solve the tough challenges of today, we need teams. We don't need individuals, we need collaboration. And so at the company that I work for, we built an artificially intelligent team coach. It's a chatbot, and you talk to it, and it talks back to you, and it coaches you on how to work better as a team. And it's fed by loads and loads of data to try to understand how that would work. But my problem with teamwork from a traditional perspective is it's usually full of anecdotes. It's usually full of nice, cute stories and horrible stock footage. So I wanted to take this concept of using data to understand teams and apply it to one of the most hardcore environments you can imagine, which is sales teams. So sales teams are notoriously individualistic environments. You've got highly competitive people who are often described as assholes, and you've got a very clear measure of performance, right? Is how much money does that sales team make? And so we asked a very simple question, which was, can we predict the performance of salespeople if we treat them as individuals? So there's a whole bunch of factors that you can use to try to understand individuals when it comes to sales. And the most typical environment is to look at personality profiling. So I want to show you how personality characteristics of salespeople translate into results. Basically, they don't. So these are 4 measures of personality. One of them is openness, so the openness to new experience. One of them is conscientiousness, which is how detail-orientated they are, how good they are at following process. One of them is agreeableness, which is how much they like to work with people rather than challenge people. And the last one is extroversion, which is where you're probably all familiar with extroversion, which is how much do you derive your energy from working with other people. And you can see that in almost every example there is a very slight but statistically insignificant correlation with performance, which basically says if you look at an individual salesperson and you measure individual characteristics about them, you can't predict performance. Which is funny because this is how we hire people, right? We look at you as an individual and we say, how can we measure you as a person? And that is going to give us an idea of how well you're going to perform as a salesperson. So I started thinking about, well, if you can't look at individuals, maybe you can start to try to understand the network that's happening in sales environments. And there's actually a guy from MIT called Sandy Pentland who's done a lot of work about this. So Sandy Pentland runs the media lab at MIT. And what he wanted to figure out was why in some teams does there seem to be a real buzz? In sales teams in particular, why does there seem to be a real atmosphere to this team? And so he looked at lots of functional team environments. He looked at ward teams. So very sort of talented and highly qualified individuals needing to collaborate or work together to do arguably the most important work, save somebody's life. He also looked at service centers, kind of the opposite from that, which is very low skill level and no real danger at the end of the day, which is answering telephone calls and doing customer service stuff. They looked at back office functions, so teams that have to sort of do all of the administration within companies. And then they looked at customer service facing roles within banks, which is arguably where you need a lot of emotional support from your colleagues, because you have to face-to-face with customers all the time, and they're usually angry with you. So you need a bit of emotional support. And what he found, and what his team found, was that communication patterns between people accounted for more than 50% of the variance in performance, which is amazing. It means that communication patterns account for more than all of the other factors you could possibly think of about measuring performance combined. So take individual skill, take motivation, take experience, take your degree, your level of education, add all of those things together and they still don't matter as much as communication patterns. And that's amazing. And so I want to show you some data that sort of brings this idea to life. He went to a financial trading site called eToro. Anyone heard of this? So one or two of you. eToro, for those of you who don't know, I don't even know if it still exists, it's essentially a social trading platform, which means I, as a user, make trades on the stock market and my trades are visible to everybody else. And you, as another user of the platform, can follow my trades, which means you can essentially copy exactly what I do. And you can allocate a proportion of your budget to follow my trade. So you could say, I want 10% of my budget to do exactly what Alistair does. And this is an interesting place to look at the effect of networks. And what they found was that there were some lone rangers out there. So these are the people down at the bottom left-hand corner. They're isolated. They don't follow anybody. They think they know best. They're going to make their trades on their own. And then right on the other end of the spectrum, so toward the right-hand side of the graph, you've got a whole bunch of people who only follow other people. So they make none of their own independent trades. They simply follow what other people do. But what was really interesting is in the middle, you had a peak. So this is a graph of the amount of return of investment on the y-axis, so how much money they made vertically, and how much they interacted with each other on the x-axis. So the more they interacted to begin with, the more money they made, and then the less, and then it gets to a tipping point where if they keep interacting too much, they suddenly make less money again. And this is interesting because it speaks to the echo chamber effect, which is I follow you, you follow Joe, Joe follows me, and we're all doing exactly the same thing. And what Pentland talks about in terms of communication patterns is this concept of exploration and engagement. And engagement, according to Pentland, is how much you share ideas with your peer group. So if I bring a new idea to my team at Sabre, and we talk about this idea a lot, we're going to refine it. But if that's the only idea that we ever refine, it's going to go round and round and round, and it's going to morph into something that's kind of useless. And what Pentland suggests is that you also need a very high degree of exploration, which is sourcing new ideas. And that's these isolated people. They're essentially sourcing new ideas, unique ideas. And what he means by communication patterns is striking the balance between new ideas and refining new ideas. And he's shown that performance has got a very clear correlation with the balance between these two things, which is when you get it right, when you've got enough new ideas and enough refinement, you get the highest level of performance. And this is, by performance, we mean money, so it's very, very tangible. So the question is, how does this play out in work? So I want to give you an example that you might all be familiar with. So this is a product release cycle in a large corporation. The grey lines, or the black lines, are digital communication, so sort of emails, SMS, that kind of stuff, and the green lines are face-to-face communication. So what Pentland wanted to show was the effect of communication patterns on performance. And it's very interesting as you start to go through the days to release a product. So management comes up with its strategy. Hey, we're all going to do this new thing, and management tell everybody what they're going to do. So they tell development, they tell sales, they tell support, and they tell customer service a little bit, because customer service don't really matter until the end, right? So management tell everybody digitally. They push all of this out to the company. At day 6, sales and support start chatting with each other because they've got a new product coming, and so they start chatting about how they're going to deliver this. They chat to each other, they only chat to each other, they don't really chat to anybody else. Management chat to them a little bit, but sales and support kind of just chat with each other. And still, the most amount of communication is happening digitally, and management is pushing everything. Nobody else is really chatting with each other. So as the launch approaches, digital communication dies down, and everybody starts to panic. Development and sales start chatting about how they're going to release this. Development are building stuff, and sales are like, how are we going to sell this? Blah, blah, blah. You know the deal. Okay, it's getting pretty close to launch now, and everyone starts to panic. So everyone starts chatting with each other. It's 2 days after launch. 2 days after launch, support and customer service are suddenly having an awful time because they didn't chat with each other before the launch, and now they're realizing all of the problems, and they've got angry customers, and so they're having this big back and forward. And there's no communication digitally because everyone is just in panic mode. And there's still a bit of chat between development and sales, because sales are like, we need this feature, we need this feature, we need this feature, and development are like, no, we're not doing it. So you have this really interesting set of communication patterns. And what I wanted to start to understand was, can you predict the performance of salespeople if you start to look at the patterns between people? So earlier we looked at whether you could predict the performance treating them as individuals. So what if you started to measure qualities about the network? So what I wanted to do was try to understand or try to predict the performance of salespeople without actually asking them about the network that they were in. What I wanted to try to do was make predictions about the network that they were in, and to see if my predictions about the network could forecast the performance. And what I mean by that is try to understand or try to predict the relationships that people would develop inside a team. So in order to sort of give this a little bit colour, I'll tell you about the founding story of Sabre. So we started looking at this problem of trying to be able to predict relationships between people with the ultimate goal of being able to predict early stage startup success or failure. So I was studying at Harvard Business School. There's a really interesting professor there called Noam Wasserman who'd written a book called The Founder's Dilemmas. And what he found was, in 83% of the cases, venture-backed startups failed to deliver a return on investment to their investors, which makes venture capital worse than market as an asset class. So if you ever think about investing, don't give it to venture capitalists because you'll lose your money. But the really interesting thing from an engineer's perspective was, in 2/3 of the cases, the failures could be traced explicitly back to team dynamics. And that was either dynamics between the founders or dynamics between the founders and early employees. And this is really interesting from an engineer's perspective because it's the one thing that you've got control over when you build a company, who you work with. Your business proposition is going to iterate. The market is definitely not in your control. But who you hire, that's the only thing you've got real control over. And so for that to be the leading cause of failure is kind of stupid. So what I wanted to understand was, can you predict the dynamics between people before you hire them? And if you think about how you measure people individually, we go back to that personality profiling, it's not particularly predictive. It's very interesting, you can do a Myers-Briggs profile and it's cool, you get this 4-letter characterization, but it doesn't predict anything about you. I work very well with introverts. I also work very well with extroverts. It's not your personality that dictates how well we're going to work together. It is something much deeper, but it's something that's so blindingly obvious. Like if I was to work with you guys, you would know very quickly whether you like me or you don't like me. You probably already know whether you like me or you don't like me. And so that's risky, I don't know. Somebody's made up their mind anyway. So what I wanted to do was to see if we could use data to predict this relationship quality. So we started with online dating. Online dating is a really rich data source that essentially tries to predict whether two people will get into a good relationship. And we sort of defined a successful relationship as two people who meet online and then close their accounts because they're in a relationship with each other. Which is interesting, because in the transactional world of online dating, people go on a lot of dates, but they leave their profiles open, like just in case they meet somebody better. So when they close their account, what they're saying is, this person is better than anyone I've met so far, and more importantly, they're better than anyone I hope to meet in the future. Yes?
Imagine that the example, they close the account because they forgot they don't want to.
Oh, so we only looked at examples where they close their account because they're in a relationship.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. It's a good point. It's a good point, yeah. And we were very pleased to see that there were clear patterns in the data that could predict this successful match. And it was around things that classical psychology wasn't even looking at. Things like whether you both have the same opinion on horror movies. You either both like them or you both dislike them. Now, on its own, it's a fairly meaningless data point. But when you add all of these data points together, it becomes meaningful. And what's really interesting when you apply it to the work environment is this process of meeting lots of people and then deciding, this person's the best person I'm going to meet, is very similar to how we hire people, how we interview people. You interview a bunch of candidates, and at some point you're like, yeah, this person is probably the best. We could keep interviewing, but to be honest, we've got to get on with it, and they'll do. And that's how we date, right? And so we took this insight from online dating and we combined it with some of the more consistent theories from academic behavior research. Things like, for a team with a broad set of tasks, it's beneficial to have a diverse set of behaviors within that team. And we put it together and we had what we thought would be a good way to measure team dynamics or predict team dynamics that would hopefully be able to forecast performance. So if you think back to communication patterns, what we're trying to do here is predict whether two people, or three or four, or a team of people will have good relationships with each other so that they want to engage with each other, so that they want to work with each other, so they don't avoid each other. And to test it, because I don't like anecdotes, I don't like cute stories, I want to see results. We went to the University of Bristol and there was a business plan competition there. And it was a week long and there were 8 teams of about 8 people in each team. And we wanted to see if our software could predict which team would win the competition without any knowledge of their skills, their experience, their demographic, or the idea that they were working on. Just whether they liked horror movies or not. So before the people arrived at the competition, we sent them a little online survey that said, do you like horror movies, etc. And then we were told who was in which team, and our software then ranked the teams from predicted best quality relationships to predicted worst quality relationships. And what was interesting was we got the precise ranking of all 8 teams spot on by the end of the event. And it speaks to what Pentland knew to be true, which is the dynamic that you have between people and the resulting communication patterns have such a profound impact on performance. So I want to show you a little bit about this. So this is people having relationships with each other, not romantic ones. Professional ones. Professional, keep it together, guys. Okay, so here is a piece of data to support this. So this is sales performance versus relationships with colleagues. So each dot is a team. Actually, each dot is a collection of teams. And you can see that teams in the bottom left have the lowest relationship quality with each other. We give it an arbitrary score out of 100. And they make the least money. Teams on the right, who have much higher relationship quality scores with each other, make orders of magnitude more money. On average, teams that have high scores, according to our model, in sales environments make 1.9 times the revenue of teams with low scores. We don't even look at skills. We don't look at experience. We don't look at even if you can speak the language you're selling. All we look at is whether you're going to be able to interact with your colleagues or not. And so even in highly competitive, individualistic environments where everybody's an arsehole, it actually matters as to whether you can form good relationships with your colleagues in dollars. Or pounds, thank you. So I'm actually at the end of my talk. I wanted to share with you 5 lessons that I tried to sprinkle throughout my little chat. The first one is we are not as complicated as we like to think. I think one of the most amazing things about human beings is our ability to convince ourselves that we're more special than we are. We're based on the same rules as the rest of physics and chemistry and biology. And I take a great deal of joy as to try to figure out those rules. And the second lesson is that teams are more important than individuals. If you want to win a Nobel Prize, you're going to have to work with somebody else, which is a big disappointment to a lot of people. So my third point is don't be a loner, but also don't be a clique. Nobody likes loners. Nobody likes cliques. So be that middle point where everybody loves you. And number 4 is keep people in the loop, even when you don't think you have to. So remember that product launch cycle? Talk to people before it goes wrong. Keep people up to date with what you are doing, help them understand. And it doesn't need to be formal. It can be informal. But keep people in the loop even when you don't think you need to. And 5 is relationships directly impact performance. So if you are in a position within your organization where you have any control over who you hire, or how you design project teams, or how you staff project teams. Spend more time thinking about how the people are going to work with each other, and less time thinking about whether you've got the right skills and the best quality people in the room. And so, just because I hate anecdotes, I'm going to finish with an anecdote. And it's a story from McDonald's. You all know McDonald's, the restaurant chain. They did a study looking at profitability in restaurants of equal market opportunity, so centre of London, centre of New York. And they wanted to figure out what was causing the difference in profitability. And McDonald's sell the same food everywhere you go. So there's no difference in the product, there's no difference in the branding, but there was a difference in the profitability. And they tried to measure all of these different things. And the one thing that stood out, the one thing that correlated with profitability more than anything else, was whether there was one person in the restaurant as a member of staff over the age of 50. And they couldn't figure out why. And went and spoke to all of the restaurants, and what they figured out was that when the younger employees were having a bad day, they'd go to the older member of staff, and the older member of staff would be like, there, don't worry about it. I've got your back. And that, in itself, translated to higher profitability per restaurant. So that's my horrible anecdote for the end. Thanks very much. I guess we have time for some questions.
Yeah, 5 minutes questions.
Great.
Some on the board?
I can't.
Cool.
So, some anonymous people at the back. Is there an individual attribute that make an applicant particularly attractive, i.e. lovableness? Well, what's interesting is that actually it's all relative. And that's a really lame answer, because no, there's not one thing that you can do to make yourself loved. What matters the most is whether you are compatible with the specific other people. And so there isn't like a sort of overwhelming trait that makes you liked by more people, other than perhaps being tolerant. So if you are tolerant of other people's differences, you are more likely to find it easier to work with them, and they are more likely to find it easier to work with you. And that is the one thing that seems to make a difference consistently. How do I delete that question? I'll just keep going. All right. So, next question. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Other than horror movies, what questions do you ask people to determine their professional compatibility? So we ask questions around 2 primary areas. One is, I'm going to call it values. And values is a super fluffy word, but there's a more technical definition, which is what are the deep intrinsic motivators that dictate why you do something, why you make a decision. And so the types of questions we ask are trying to get to the reasons why you do something. And the second type of question we spend most of the time asking is, what types of reason do you find acceptable? So if I don't know, agree to come and talk at ASOS because I think they're going to pay me loads of money to talk, right? And that is that's the reason. And they turn around and say, actually, no, we're just doing it because we think the community should get together and do this for the love. Those are 2 kind of incompatible reasonings as to why. And so we look at why you do something and what the reasoning that's acceptable to you. Does that make sense? Kind of. Okay. But for the record, we like you. Thanks, guys. That's a great question. Empathy all the way. People have the power. We love you, dude. All right. This is great. How would you measure the relationships of remote teams where face-to-face meetings are not possible? And so this is what I think software has the ability to do, which is to measure things independently of needing to observe the situation. And so what we always try to do with data is to try to understand the types of characteristics that would make people compatible if they met. So we try to predict relationships before you need to know each other. It's no point having a piece of software that relies on measuring relationships only when people know each other. So if you're trying to hire me into your company, it's useless if I have to know everybody in the company already to measure those relationships. What we want to do with software is to try to understand what will make these people compatible if they meet.
Sorry to just interject.
Go.
With that point, who do you start with? Who's supposed to get on with the first person?
How do you build a team from scratch?
Yeah, like if you're starting with one person, who's just get on with that person and that person, where does it start?
Yeah, so two different places where this usually starts. Sometimes it is you who are trying to build a team around you, in which case you're the starting point. You don't want to build a team that is going to reject you. That's going to be an uncomfortable experience. But the other environment is if you are building a team that you are not going to be in, but you want that team to be successful. And in those environments, what we find is the most successful way to do it is to pick the people you think are going to be critical for the success of the project and build the team around them. And it sounds kind of glorifying certain people, but it is generally, there are usually a few people who will be required, either because Mario's joining.
Answer.
Usually because for all sorts of reasons, like decision making, this person is going to be required to make the decisions, etc. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Cool.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So this is really cool stuff, but it always applies to sort of the genesis of the team. How can we apply some of these learnings to teams that we're already working in?
Yeah, really good answer. What do you do when you've got the people you've got and you can't choose? So the key to that is don't be a loner, but don't be a clique. So it's about points 3 and 4, which is communication patterns. So it is about forcing yourself to share information within that team and making sure that that team don't isolate themselves from the information that's going to be required from the rest of the business. So it's trying to make sure that you strike that balance between what Penman calls exploration, sourcing new ideas, and engagement, refining those ideas once you receive them. Make sense? And interestingly, I'll come to you in a sec, the exploration part is most effective when you are sourcing ideas from very different sources. So one of the questions we often get is, okay, but what about diversity? Surely you're just building teams where everybody is the same. And the answer to that is not if they're all coming from very different experience backgrounds. So if they are able to bring ideas from a unique source to the team, that's the diversity you want to maximize. It's the diversity of idea generation or the diversity of exploration. Make sense? Cool.
So they could be also a software to do that, like periodically, maybe the structure of the teams within the company can change, like you can reshuffle something.
Yeah, some companies have the ability to reshuffle teams. For example, we're working with the Bank of Ireland.
Yeah, but do you think you can do this scientifically? So let's say here in ASOS we can just apply these rules, like go on a website, answer the question, we're going to reshuffle you and put you in a team. Would it be possible, or at least make it achievable? Like,
What are you saying, dude?
Well,
He doesn't like to work with you.
one of the things that's really interesting when you work in the analytics space is that most people in the analytics space don't work with people. They work with data and numbers and process. And they're the people who are like, follow the data. Follow the data. And when you start applying the data to people, it all goes really badly wrong because you suddenly have to deal with emotions. You suddenly have to deal with real people. I was listening to a talk by somebody who's very senior in the F1 industry and works for one of the teams, and he's a sort of analytics guy there, and said, when you show fair data to fair people, they will make fair decisions. And that is true in all scenarios except people analytics, is when you show fair data to fair people, they make irrational and like emotional decisions. So if I say, hey, I've run you through an algorithm, and I think you're going to be way better over there, so off you go. And you're like, well, hold on a sec, I'm in London, I've got a family here, I don't want to move to New York, please can your algorithm factor that in? And I'm like, no, follow the data, off you go. It's an extreme example, but when you start working with people and human systems, you have to start to pay attention to the stuff that can't quite be measured like that. So, and this is why I think we need to be quite careful when we start using analytics within organizations, that we don't do it blindly, that we do it sensitively. Makes sense? Have I got one more question? Has anyone got a particular question they would like answered? Shall I answer the one with 4 likes? If you build teams of people you get along with, do you not agree you will end up with like-minded people with very few new ideas? I think I answered that one already, right? Number 2, what happens if everyone in the team is having a bad day? I look forward to tomorrow. There's no rule for that. There's no. Tomorrow will happen, and the important thing is to not dwell on it, not focus on it. The important thing is just to remember the principles that tend to work long term, which is share information, make sure you're bringing in new information, and if you have a bad day, go home, have a beer, glass of wine. That's it. All right. Thanks very much, guys.